Welcome back, everybody, to this deep dive where we'll be taking on the roles of detectives.
Ooh, detectives!
To uncover the true uniting Qibla for humanity.
Very cool.
So, we're going to be piecing together these clues from ancient texts, geography, history, and all these clues seem to point to one idea.
Okay.
And that's that all prophets sought the same sacred spot.
Baka, Jerusalem.
Baka, Jerusalem. Now, what's really fascinating is that our sources are suggesting that this location might not be where we traditionally think it is.
Oh.
Yeah, we're going to be challenging some established narratives, like the location of Mecca and the Promised Land.
So already, right off the bat, our sources are kind of throwing a curveball.
Yeah.
They're suggesting that the Promised Land that we typically associate with modern-day Israel, Palestine, is actually located in Jordan.
Wow.
And they're pointing to specific biblical locations like Mount Hor, Petra, Wadi Raba.
Right. All falling within Jordan's borders.
I mean, if we even just entertain this reinterpretation for a second, it really shakes things up.
Yeah.
Not only does it really challenge how we understand the Holy Land, but, it also makes us ask, what else have we inherited that may not be entirely accurate?
Exactly. The author even goes as far as to suggest a vast conspiracy. Yeah, to obscure the true location, maybe for control over resources, religious authority, things like that.
Okay, so now things are getting really interesting, right?
Yeah.
So the author then connects this reinterpretation of the Promised Land to Mecca. Specifically the, I guess you could call it an economic powerhouse.
Right.
That desert Mecca has become a $350 billion economy.
Wow.
And they're suggesting a historical link between this wealth and the ancient Israelites.
Okay.
Particularly their control over trade routes.
And the Khazna treasury in Petra.
Interesting.
So this connection then brings us to the author's central argument that Baka, Jerusalem, not Mecca, is the true Qibla. They're bringing in Quranic verses and biblical references to support this claim.
Okay.
And they even suggest that Mecca Petra might have actually been a center of... I guess you could say negative spiritual influence, a place of temptation.
Oh, okay.
That kind of drew people away from the true Qibla.
So are we saying that Mecca is completely irrelevant?
Well, not necessarily.
What?
I mean, remember, we're exploring multiple perspectives here.
Right.
The sources do acknowledge Mecca Petra as a historically significant location.
Yeah.
Possibly even a mother city, so to speak, for the children of Israel.
Okay.
However, they argue that it may have also been a place of worldly distractions.
Okay.
And that led people away from that true spiritual center, Baka, Jerusalem.
All right, so we have this alternative location for the Qibla, but what makes Baka, Jerusalem so special? Why this place?
That's a great question.
Right.
What makes it stand out as this true uniting Qibla for humanity?
Yeah, why is it so important?
Well, our sources point to a few key aspects of this region.
Okay.
First, they highlight the importance of the Valley of Gethsemane, or Jathamim, which is described as the place where wrongdoers will be judged. And its proximity to Jerusalem places it within this proposed sacred precinct of Baka, Jerusalem.
So it's almost like this Valley of Gethsemane acts as this spiritual boundary, separating those who are accepted from those who are not.
Yeah, like a physical manifestation of divine judgment.
I like that. That's a really interesting way to put it.
Thank you.
The sources also emphasize the Dead Sea, or, what they call the lowest land, as the point where divine messages descend to earth. And this connects to a very fascinating concept that the author calls the spatial constancy of the Quran.
Spatial constancy?
Yeah.
What does that mean?
So think of it this way. Certain geographic locations that are mentioned in the Quran, they have a fixed and unchanging spiritual significance, regardless of any historical events or interpretations.
Interesting.
So in this case, the Dead Sea, being the lowest point on Earth, acts as this connection point between the heavens and earth, a place where divine revelation can flow down.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the bigger picture here.
Yeah.
It suggests a permanence to these sacred locations, something that transcends time and human understanding. Right. It's as if these locations are woven into the very fabric of existence.
Exactly.
That's powerful.
And this concept of spatial constancy, it applies to the entire area surrounding Baka, Jerusalem. The author draws our attention to specific language in the Quran and argues that mistranslations and misinterpretations, particularly from the original Arabic, have kind of obscured the true meaning of key terms and locations.
So, wait, are you saying that we might be misinterpreting the very words that guide us?
That's what the sources suggest.
Wow.
Yeah, they focus on words like, for example, haram, meaning sacred, and moharam, meaning forbidden.
Right.
And they argue that these terms have been used interchangeably, and it's blurred their distinct meanings, and this impacts how we understand these sacred sites.
Right, right.
They also delve into the word tawaf, and its traditional understanding suggesting that it might differ from its original meaning.
Okay.
Which could potentially change how we perceive the Hajj pilgrimage.
This adds a whole other layer to our investigation.
Yeah.
It's not just about pinpointing the right location on a map,
right,
but it's about understanding the language that defines these locations.
Right.
And the practices that go along with them.
Right.
We have to consider the possibility that centuries of translation, interpretation, even cultural bias may have, I guess you could say, distorted our understanding of these core concepts.
Absolutely. And to further their argument, they introduce this concept of two mountains.
Two mountains.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sinai and Snin as key geographical markers for this sacred area.
I thought Mount Sinai was like the mountain.
Right. The place where Moses, received the 10 Commandments. That's the common understanding,
Okay.
But the sources point to this duality that's often overlooked in religious geography. They suggest that Mount Sinai, which is west of the Dead Sea, represents one half of this sacred landscape.
Right.
While Mount Sinin, which is located to the east of the Dead Sea, kind of completes the picture.
So it's as if these two mountains act as these pillars, defining the boundaries of a sacred space.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
With the Dead Sea, that lowest land sitting right in the middle.
Exactly. And this is where the Valley of Tua enters the picture.
All right.
The sources describe it as this folded valley in the Great Rift Valley, nestled between these two mountains.
Okay.
And they connect these geographical features to verses that mention specific locations in the journeys of prophets, implying that this entire area, the two mountains, the valley and the Dead Sea, form this sacred precinct.
Okay, let me make sure I'm following this. We have Sinai and Sinin. They're marking the east and west boundaries of this sacred area.
Right.
Between them lies the Valley of Tua.
Yeah.
A folded valley in the Great Rift Valley.
Yeah.
And at the heart of it all is the Dead Sea.
Exactly.
The lowest land
right.
is this entire area, according to the sources, the true sacred precinct, with Baka, Jerusalem at its spiritual center.
Precisely. Wow. And within this sacred precinct, we find a hierarchical structure.
Okay.
The rock, representing the Holy of Holies, is located within the house, the Kaaba, which itself sits within the larger precinct of Baka, Jerusalem.
It's like a series of nested circles, each one signifying a different level of sacredness.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really interesting.
Yeah.
But how does this relate to the Qibla?
Well,
if Baka, Jerusalem is this multi-layered sacred precinct, where exactly should people direct their prayers?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
The sources address this by arguing that Baka, Jerusalem isn't meant to be understood as a single literal city.
Right.
Instead, it represents a spiritual and strategic center, a place of knowledge, worship, and refuge.
So it's less about finding a specific spot on a map and more about aligning oneself with a broader spiritual concept.
Exactly.
This sacred energy that emanates from Baka, Jerusalem.
You're getting it.
Okay.
Yeah, the sources emphasize that this sacred precinct isn't just about rituals or physical location. It's about embodying the values and principles that Baka, Jerusalem represents, a place of knowledge, peace, and refuge for all.
I mean, this is pretty mind-blowing.
It is, yeah.
We've gone from questioning the location of the Promised Land to uncovering this vast, interconnected, sacred landscape centered around Baka, Jerusalem.
Yeah.
It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It feels like solving a mystery.
Yeah.
Where every clue reveals another layer of meaning.
And we're just scratching the surface.
I know. It's so fascinating.
There's so much more to explore.
And ready to dive deeper.
Yeah.
What's next on our detectives agenda?
Well, our sources suggest that this sacred landscape around Baka, Jerusalem, might actually have significance for all of humanity, not just specific religions.
Interesting.
They bring up this idea of like a universal pilgrimage to this location, suggesting a shared spiritual heritage for everyone.
I mean, this concept of a universal pilgrimage really captures my imagination.
I know, right?
It hints at this common ground that connects us all, regardless of our individual beliefs.
Yeah.
But, you know, how do they support this idea with evidence?
Well, they connect this concept of universal pilgrimage to specific verses in the Quran.
Okay.
And they emphasize the importance of, seeking knowledge, understanding, and ultimately truth. And it seems like they're arguing that this search for truth, it's a universal human pursuit. It transcends religious boundaries.
I see. They're citing verses like Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 198, which mentions departing from Arafat and remembering Allah at Al-Mashar al-Haram.
Right, which is traditionally associated with the Hajj pilgrimage to Mecca.
Right.
However, our author reinterprets this verse, suggesting that it actually refers to Baka, Jerusalem. They connect Arafat or Ararat to the story of Noah's Ark, which is mentioned in both the Quran and the Bible.
That's an interesting connection. It's like they're drawing this parallel between Noah's Ark as this symbol of refuge, and Baka, Jerusalem, as this spiritual sanctuary for all of humanity.
Exactly.
That's a cool connection.
They also point out that the verse mentions Al-Mashar al-Haram, which they interpret as the sacred lighthouse. This term is often overlooked in traditional interpretations, but they present it as representing the most significant sacred place on earth.
Yeah, so the sacred lighthouse.
Yeah.
That's a powerful image.
It is.
What exactly does it represent?
Well, according to our sources, it symbolizes the Holy of Holies within Baka, Jerusalem.
Okay.
A place they claim has been obscured by, traditional interpretations.
So it's not just a physical location, but a concept.
Right.
A symbol of divine presence and guidance.
Yeah.
For everyone.
Yeah, for everyone.
Regardless of their specific beliefs.
That seems to be the idea. Yeah, and the forces go on to connect this sacred lighthouse to the Dome of the Rock, highlighting its historical and spiritual significance.
Right.
They even draw a connection to a verse in Surah at Taba, verse 40, which mentions a cave where the Prophet Muhammad received divine support.
Wait a minute.
Yeah.
Are they suggesting that this cave is actually the Dome of the Rock?
Yes.
That's a bold reinterpretation.
It is. It is. But it fits into their broader argument about mistranslations and historical distortions obscuring the true Qibla.
Right.
They're suggesting that we need to re-examine our traditional understandings of these locations.
So this brings us back to the importance of language and its impact on our understanding of these concepts.
Exactly.
Our sources, they emphasize that understanding the original Arabic of the Quran is key to grasping the true meanings of these locations and concepts.
They argue that many words have been mistranslated or misinterpreted over time, which has led to confusion and misunderstandings about these sacred sites.
They seem particularly focused on haram and moharam, two words that are often used interchangeably, but have very distinct meanings.
Right. They emphasize that haram means sacred in the sense of being consecrated by Allah, a pure sanctuary for worship.
Right.
And this idea fits with their concept of Baka, Jerusalem as this sacred precinct, a place where people of all backgrounds can connect with the divine. Wow. And then you have Muharram, which means forbidden.
Right, something that's prohibited or off limits.
Exactly. And this is where the distinction between Baka Jerusalem and Mecca Petra becomes crucial. All right. The sources argue that while historically important, Mecca Petra was actually a place of temptation and worldly influences, a distraction from the true Qibla located in Baka, Jerusalem.
It seems like they're presenting Mecca Petra as representing Muharram, the forbidden, while Baka, Jerusalem represents Haram, the sacred.
That's a great way to summarize it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and this distinction has implications not only for our understanding of these specific locations, but also for how we approach spirituality as a whole.
So it's about reevaluating our understanding of what's truly sacred, looking beyond the surface to grasp that deeper meaning.
Yes, and this reevaluation requires a careful examination of the language, the history, and the geography associated with these locations.
One fascinating example of this this reevaluation that our sources provide is their analysis of Surah Ibrahim, verse 37.
Okay.
This verse mentions Abraham settling some of his descendants in a valley without cereal crops near Allah's sacred house.
Right.
And traditionally, this verse is interpreted as referring to Mecca. But the author points out that the specific details, the lack of cereal crops, the proximity to a valley, point to a different location, the lower Jordan Valley near Baka, Jerusalem.
It's like they're detectives carefully piecing together clues to solve a historical puzzle.
Yes.
By, meticulously analyzing the words in their context.
Yeah.
They arrive at a different understanding of the events.
Exactly. And their detective work leads to a remarkable conclusion. They propose that Abraham's descendants were sent to this valley near the forbidden Mecca Petra to guide people toward faith. And away from the negative spiritual influences of that location. So it's a bit of a spiritual tug of war. This battle between the sacred and the forbidden playing out across this ancient landscape.
And according to our sources, this battle continues to this day. They present the struggle to understand the true Qibla, to decipher the messages of the prophets, and to live according to divine principles as an ongoing journey for all of humanity.
I mean, we've covered so much ground already.
We have.
From questioning the location of the Promised Land to this concept of a universal pilgrimage. The difference between Haram and Muharram, and even this idea of the spatial constancy of the Quran.
Right.
And yet it feels like we're only scratching the surface.
There's still so much more to uncover.
I know.
Yeah, we need to explore how these sacred locations connect to, the origins of humanity. Delve deeper into, the lowest land as this point of divine revelation and examine what these reinterpretations mean for our understanding of religious history and practice.
Yeah. I mean, where do we go from here? What's the next step in our investigation?
Well,
so we've been on this incredible journey, tracing the clues to uncover the true Qibla. But it seems like this investigation goes even deeper.
It does.
Connecting these sacred locations to the very origins of humanity.
Our sources take this fascinating approach by weaving together, scientific and religious perspectives on this topic.
Interesting.
They cite Quranic verses that describe, the creation of humanity from clay. They connect this to the blessed land of Palestine, illuminated by the light of its Lord.
They even bring up a verse from Surah Al-Hijr, verse 26, which mentions creating man from clay like pottery.
It's like they're suggesting that the very material that we're made from can be found in this sacred land.
It reinforces that idea of spatial constancy.
Yeah, exactly.
What we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
It's not just about these abstract concepts or spiritual beliefs, but it's about a tangible link between humanity and this specific location.
Exactly.
So Baka Jerusalem becomes more than just a spiritual center. It becomes the starting point of our journey, both physically and spiritually.
Exactly. This origin story then leads them to the concept of a successive authority on earth, as mentioned in Surah Al-Baqarah, verse 30. And they suggest that this authority refers to, a lineage of prophets, all guided by divine wisdom, and tasked with upholding truth and justice.
It sounds like a chain of spiritual inheritance passed down through generations.
Yeah, like a passing of the torch.
With each prophet building upon the teachings of those who came before.
Right.
But how does this tie back to the Qibla?
Well, they highlight the importance of the Valley of Gethsemane, or Jathamine, within this lineage. And they describe it as the place where, where our actions will be judged, a physical representation of the spiritual reckoning that we'll all face.
It's located right near Jerusalem, within that proposed sacred precinct.
Right, exactly.
It's a sobering thought.
It is.
But it really emphasizes the weight of this sacred precinct. It's not just a place of historical interest. It's where our choices has consequences.
This concept of accountability connects to the idea of purification, which is a recurring theme throughout throughout our sources.
Yeah. They cite the story of Abraham and Ishmael being tasked with purifying the house.
Right.
And they're suggesting that this act represents not only a physical cleansing, but also a spiritual transformation.
Exactly. They even link this purification to the mission of the Prophet Muhammad, emphasizing the importance of, confronting falsehood and upholding truth in every aspect of life.
And that brings us full circle back to that distinction between haram and muharram.
Yeah, they argue that purifying the sacred precinct involves not only embracing what is haram, but also rejecting what is muharram.
Right, those negative influences.
Right, exactly.
Like can lead us astray.
So it's about making, conscious choices, constantly discerning between what aligns with our, higher purpose and what holds us back.
It's not enough to simply face the right direction when we pray.
Right.
We have to align our whole being, our thoughts, words, and actions with the spiritual essence of Baka Jerusalem.
That's the heart of it.
Wow.
The true Qibla, it isn't just a location on a map. It's a way of life. It's about striving for knowledge, living with compassion, and fighting for justice in everything we do.
Right. Okay, so here's where things get really interesting. This source starts bringing in, science. They've got geological maps showing tectonic activity in volcanoes around Mecca.
Oh, wow. So they're using scientific evidence to support their claims.
Exactly. They're arguing that Mecca is not a safe place for a holy site because of all this geological instability.
That's a fascinating approach. It's not every day you see someone blending faith and scientific data like that.
I know, right? And they don't stop there. They bring up historical accounts, talk about the Byzantine defeat, Jewish alliances with other powers.
It sounds like they're trying to create a really comprehensive argument.
They are. They even talk about, the economics of pilgrimage, who profits from it and all that.
So they're looking at the political and economic dimensions of religion as well.
Exactly. It's like they're weaving together this whole tapestry of, religion, history, science, economics, all to make their point.
And it's up to us to decide how those pieces fit together. Whether we agree with their conclusions or not, it's clear they've put a lot of thought into this.
Yeah, it's definitely thought-provoking. But then the text takes a turn and gets really personal. The author starts talking about, questioning traditions and the impact of technology on knowledge.
To a more introspective approach.
Totally. They talk about how important it is to, think for yourself and not just believe everything you're told.
A call for critical thinking.
Yes. And they have this amazing analogy. They compare the brain to a university of prayer.
A university of prayer. I like that.
Right. And they talk about how questioning and dialogue create luminous neural pathways in the brain.
So they're saying that faith shouldn't be about blind acceptance, but about active engagement and intellectual exploration.
Exactly. Our brains are meant to be used even when it comes to faith.
So the source, it gets into some pretty deep linguistic analysis. They're saying that certain terms have been, mistranslated or misinterpreted over time.
Okay, yeah, what? Give me an example.
Well, they claim that the word tawaf, which usually refers to, the circling of the Kaaba during Hajj, actually describes an oscillatory movement, back and forth between 2 points.
Hold on. So they're saying that, the whole ritual of circling the Kaaba could be based on a mistranslation.
That's what they're suggesting, yeah.
Wow. That's a big deal. I mean, how could something like that even happen?
Well, language changes over time, right? Meaning shift. They even suggest that the word Kaaba itself just means, like, a place of pedestrian traffic.
So any busy place could be a Kaaba?
Potentially, yeah. According to their interpretation, they're saying the true Kaaba could be in Jerusalem, not Mecca, and it might not even be a building, you know, just a concept, a gathering place.
Wow. Okay.
Wow.
So that's a pretty different way of looking at things.
It is, it is. And they make a distinction between, you know, Al-Bayt al-Haram, like the sacred house, and Al-Bayt al-Muharram, the forbidden house.
Okay, and what's the difference?
Well, they're saying these are two separate locations that have been kind of, you know, lumped together in modern interpretations.
So they're basically redrawing the map of, like, Islamic sacred geography.
That's one way to put it, yeah.
That's pretty radical. What do you make of all this?
Well, remember, we're just presenting these ideas, you know, not endorsing them. It's up to you, the listener, to decide what you think. But it definitely makes you wonder, doesn't it? Like, what other assumptions are we making about history and religion that might not be accurate?
Yeah, good point. Okay, so one thing I find interesting is how this source brings together, like, linguistics, history, and their own interpretation of the Quran, all to support this, like, alternative narrative.
Yeah, and they're not afraid to challenge, you know, some deeply held beliefs.
And they bring in science, too. Like, remember those geological maps? Volcanoes around Mecca?
Right, right. They're arguing it's not a safe place for a holy city.
Exactly. It's like they're building a legal case, presenting all this different evidence.
It is, it is. Whether you agree with them or not, it's definitely thought-provoking.
It makes you think, for sure. Okay, there's this term they keep using, Quraysh. Can you give us some context on that?
Sure. The Quraysh, they were a powerful tribe in Mecca, merchants. And the Prophet Muhammad, he was a member of that tribe.
Okay, so important in Islamic history.
Traditionally, yes. But this source, they interpret Quraysh more broadly. Like, they say it represents the lineage of all prophets, from Adam to Muhammad.
Okay, so they're expanding the definition.
Yeah, and they're distinguishing this lineage from the children of Israel, tracing it back to the Canaanites.
So challenging traditional genealogies and tribal identity.
Exactly. They emphasize the term Arab, saying it signifies, like, original pure nature.
Interesting. They're rewriting the cast of characters, so to speak.
Yeah, it's about reclaiming the narrative, you know?
Yeah.
Reinterpreting key terms, historical events, all to support their claims about the true locations of these religious sites.
They're asking us to see history in a whole new light.
That's right.
Okay, and another term that comes up a lot is Gog and Magog.
Oh, yes. In traditional Islamic eschatology, you know, the study of end times Gog and Magog are these hostile forces. They're going to appear, you know, at the end of the world.
Right, like an apocalyptic kind of thing.
That's right. But this source, they use these terms to refer to specific groups within the children of Israel.
Okay, so not just symbolic figures.
No, they're saying these are real groups, real people who they believe, you know, have corrupted the faith.
They're associating them with, like, negative characteristics, right? Corruption, sorcery.
Right, exactly. And again, we see this this recurring suspicion of certain Jewish groups. It's a consistent theme in this source.
Oh, it's definitely something to be aware of as we're reading this. Okay, so they also talked about the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanids, those Persian rulers.
Yeah, they're setting the historical stage, you know, highlighting all these alliances and conflicts in the region.
Right, because this was all happening, you know, during the early days of Islam.
Exactly. And they're saying that the Byzantine defeat at the hands of the Sassanids, well, this allowed the children of Israel, who they've been, you know, portraying negatively, to gain control of Jerusalem.
Okay, so they're connecting these big historical events to their own narrative about, like, the true locations of these religious sites.
Right. It's all part of a bigger picture for them, like a struggle for control over these sacred places.
It's like they're seeing this, like, hidden hand guiding history, a spiritual battle playing out over centuries.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And it reminds us that religious history is always intertwined with, you know, politics, economics, all these things.
Right, right. Okay, there are a few details that really stuck with me, like that story about the spider web.
Oh, yeah, that's an interesting one.
It's in Jewish and Christian traditions, right?
Great.
And they use it to challenge the traditional account of, you know, the Prophet Muhammad's flight from Mecca.
They say it might not have happened the way we think it did. They point to similar stories about, you know, saints hiding in caves.
Right, like maybe it's a borrowed story or something.
It makes you wonder, you know, how these stories travel across cultures and religions.
Yeah, and how much of what we believe is actually, like, original?
That's a good question to ask.
Okay, and then there's this whole thing about the number 7.
7?
Yeah, they keep coming back to it, like the 7 circles around the arm in tefillin.
Ah, right, the little boxes with verses from the Torah.
Exactly. And the 7-year cycles in Jewish agriculture, like, what's the significance of that number?
Well, 7 is a powerful number in many traditions. Represents, completeness, perfection.
Okay, so they're looking at these rituals and practices, like uncover the deeper meaning.
And they're looking for potential distortions, places where the original meaning might have been lost.
Okay, now this is a big one. They say that the true mother of villages is actually Mecca in Petra, Jordan, not the Mecca we know.
Right. That's a central part of their argument. They interpret that Quranic verse, the one about the mother of villages, as referring to Petra. They believe that this location was a central hub for, many prophets, including Abraham and Moses, and that it was like a center of good and evil, but ultimately rejected by God in favor of Jerusalem.
So they're reinterpreting a key Quranic term and connecting it to their narrative about, like, the corruption of Mecca and the sanctity of Jerusalem.
Exactly. It's a pretty big shift in perspective.
Yeah, it really is. It makes you wonder if there are other places and stories in religious history that have been, like, misinterpreted or forgotten.
That's a great question to ponder. What other assumptions might we be making that could be challenged?
All right. So they also discuss a bunch of historical events that are traditionally associated with Mecca, like the Byzantine defeat, the Treaty of Hudaybiyah.
Right, and they're relocating these events, saying they actually took place in Jordan, around Petra.
So they're rewriting the entire geographical and historical narrative.
It's a bold move. They're asking us to rethink everything we thought we knew about early Islam.
Okay, what about their interpretation of the story of Moses and the Israelites?
They say the Exodus didn't happen from Egypt, but from Palestine. They even point to specific locations in the Jordan Valley.
So they're challenging the whole story of the Exodus.
That's right. They're offering a completely different perspective.
Wow. Okay, there's this part where they connect the Quranic story about the lowest land where the Byzantines were defeated with the Dead Sea.
Yes, the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth.
Exactly. So they're using geography to support their claim that the Prophet Muhammad's night journey, the ascension to heaven, that happened in Jerusalem near the Dead Sea.
They're saying that Adna, which means lower or closer, refers to physical proximity as well as spiritual closeness to God.
So they're blending the literal and the symbolic.
Exactly.
Okay, they also have this interesting interpretation of the term uncultivated valley.
Right. They say it refers to a specific region, the lower Jordan Valley. They point out that the Quran says this valley has no cereal crops, and they note that, that area is not good for growing grain.
So they're using, like, environmental details to support their claims.
It's very detail-oriented, their analysis.
It is. Okay, now this one's really interesting. They're saying that Miss in the Quran refers to Palestine, not Egypt.
Right. That goes against the traditional understanding.
Big time. So what's their reasoning there?
They claim that Misr was mistranslated. They say it actually refers to Palestine, and they use that to support their claim that the Exodus actually happened from Palestine. They even say the Quran uses a different term, Algypt, for modern-day Egypt.
So it all hinges on how you translate this one word.
And it shows how powerful translation can be, how it can shape our understanding of these important texts.
They also talk a lot about purification. What do they mean by that?
Well, for them, purification means cleansing these sacred sites from, corruption and idolatry.
Okay, so like a spiritual cleansing.
Yeah, but also a historical process. They say that both Abraham and the Prophet Muhammad, they were tasked with purifying Mecca and Jerusalem.
Right, getting rid of the bad influences.
Exactly, because they believe that the true locations of these holy sites have been, obscured and corrupted over time.
So they're on a mission to set the record straight.
That's a good way to put it, yeah.
They also make a distinction between Mecca and Bakka.
Right, Mecca is the city in Saudi Arabia, but they say that's the wrong place for pilgrimage.
Okay, so Bakka is the true holy city.
Yeah, they say it's Jerusalem. That's where the real Kaaba is.
Wow, okay. So they're creating a whole new geography of faith.
They are, yeah.
They also mentioned something called a sacred lighthouse. What's that all about?
They're talking about the Holy of Holies within the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem. They say that's the most sacred spot on earth.
Okay, so not the Kaaba in Mecca.
No. They say that the Quranic verse mentioning, Al-Masjid al-Haram, That's not talking about the mosque in Mecca, but the sacred precinct in Jerusalem.
So again, reinterpreting a key term.
And emphasizing the sanctity of Jerusalem over Mecca.
Right. Okay, what about their interpretation of Mount Arafat? That's where pilgrims gather during Hajj.
Right. They say it's not in Mecca. They connect it to Mount Ararat from the story of Noah's Ark.
Wait, so they're bringing in biblical stories to reinterpret an Islamic ritual?
Yeah. They're saying these different religious traditions are more connected than we think.
Interesting. They're also pretty critical of modern-day religious leaders, both Islamic and Christian.
They say these leaders have strayed from the true teachings. That's right.
Okay, they mentioned some things from Jewish tradition, the Talmud and the Mishnah. Can you give us some background on that?
Sure. The Talmud, it's a collection of Jewish law and tradition, compiled over centuries. It's got two parts, the Mishnah, which is like a written record of oral law, and the Gemara, which is a commentary on the Mishnah. Okay,
so it's a pretty complex text.
It is very complex.
Yeah.
And this source, they use the Talmud as an example of, a rigorous approach to knowledge. They see parallels with how early Christians and Muslims developed their own religious writings.
So they're saying these different traditions might have influenced each other.
That's right. It's a reminder that religious ideas don't just appear out of nowhere. They're shaped by, interactions between cultures.
Okay, so they also talk about some key figures who are important in transmitting knowledge.
Right. They mention Paul of Tarsus in Christianity and Ka'b al-Ahbar in Islam. Both originally Jewish, but they converted. And they were really influential in shaping Christian and Islamic thought.
So they're like bridges between the traditions.
That's a good way to put it. And it reminds us that these are real people, with their own stories.
It brings it to life a little bit. Okay, now here's a big claim. They say that the Prophet Muhammad actually preached from the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, not from Mecca.
That's a pretty radical assertion. They're basing it on their interpretation of that Quranic verse about the cave, where the prophet sought refuge.
Right, the cave.
They say that's not the cave in Mecca, but the cave under the Dome of the Rock, which they say is the Holy of Holies.
So another reinterpretation of a key verse?
And another challenge to the traditional narrative.
They also reinterpret the verse about the lowest land, where the Byzantines were defeated.
Right. They say that refers to the Dead Sea, and then they connect that to the Prophet Muhammad's night journey.
So again, they're blending literal and symbolic interpretation.
They're always looking for those connections.
Okay, so this source is pretty critical of the children of Israel. Who are they talking about?
They're referring to specific groups within the Jewish community. They say these groups have, distorted the true teachings of the Torah, and they've had a negative impact on history.
Okay, so it's not all Jewish people.
Right. It's important to be clear about that.
And they're very specific in their criticisms. They talk about corruption, sorcery, alliances with enemies.
They definitely have a strong opinion about these groups.
They do. Okay, what about those historical events that we usually associate with Mecca, like the Battle of Uhud and the Treaty of Hudaybiyah?
They're saying those events didn't happen in Mecca. They happened in Jordan near Petra.
So again, rewriting the map of history.
Exactly.
Okay, so they also analyze the term al-Masjid al-Haram, which is usually understood as the Grand Mosque in Mecca.
Right. They say it actually refers to the sacred precinct in Jerusalem, the area around the Dome of the Rock.
So more reinterpretations.
It's a consistent pattern in this source.
Yeah, it is. Okay, there's a verse about the expulsion of those who disbelieved among the people of the scripture from their homes. How do they interpret that?
They say it's about the expulsion of certain Jewish groups from Jerusalem, groups that they believe had corrupted the faith and allied with enemies.
Okay, so again, we see this suspicion of certain Jewish groups.
Right. And they see it as a precedent, for their own efforts to purify Jerusalem.
To make it the center of true worship.
That's right.
Okay, there's also this story, the muddy spring of life.
Ah, yes. They interpret that as a symbol of creation, specifically linked to Palestine.
Because they believe that Jerusalem is the true center of God's creation.
Exactly. They're bringing together different threads to support that claim.
Right. Okay, they also make this connection between the Valley of Gethsemane, the place where Jesus prayed, and the idea of judgment in the Quran.
They say that's where, those who have been judged unworthy will be gathered.
Wow, okay, so a place of punishment.
A symbol of separation, between those who are saved and those who are condemned.
A pretty intense image. Okay, so here's another really controversial claim. They say that the Prophet Muhammad's night journey and ascension to heaven, that wasn't a physical journey.
Right. They say it was a spiritual experience.
Yeah.
And that it happened entirely in Palestine.
So no trip to Mecca or Jerusalem?
Not according to their interpretation.
Wow. Okay, and they're really challenging scholars to, prove them wrong.
They say they have the truth. They're very confident in their interpretation.
It's a bold statement.
It is.
Okay, they also make this interesting point about synonyms in Arabic, how that can lead to, misinterpretations of the Quran.
Right. They say the Arabic language is very rich, very nuanced, and that we need to be careful about how we translate it.
So a more literal approach.
Yeah, paying attention to the context.
Okay, and they make a distinction between haram and muharram.
Right. Haram means sacred, like something consecrated by God, and muharram means forbidden.
Okay, so two different categories of holy places.
Exactly. And they say that this distinction has been lost in many modern interpretations.
Okay, they also talk about the word Stein.
Stein.
Yeah.
Well, that's a German word. It means stone. And they connect it to the Hebrew name for Jerusalem, Yerushalayim. They also point out that Stein can mean like a pip or a kernel, suggesting a connection between, the physical rock of Jerusalem and the spiritual essence of Revelation.
So they're bringing in all these different meanings, different languages.
They're really digging deep.
They are. Okay, so they also talk about, the economics of pilgrimage.
Right. They're critical of the commercialization of pilgrimage, especially in Mecca.
They say it's become a money-making scheme.
Yeah, and they contrast that with Petra, which they believe was the real Mecca.
Okay, so they're making a moral judgment about how pilgrimage is practiced today.
They are. They're concerned about the exploitation of religious belief.
Okay, and they're pretty harsh on the foolish imams of disbelief.
They see those leaders as having abandoned the true teachings.
So they're not just critiquing interpretations, they're critiquing the people in authority.
They're calling for a change in leadership, a return to what they see as the pure form of the faith.
It's a powerful message.
It is.
It's amazing, right?
Yeah.
The source, it just pulls you in with all these different threads. Language, history, geography, even economics. And this deep personal reflection on faith.
Yeah, and they're not afraid to, shake things up, challenge the status quo.
Totally, they're questioning everything. Okay, so they keep coming back to this idea of Baka, Jerusalem, as the true center of worship. Oh. Can you, sum up their argument for us?
Sure, they're drawing on, all sorts of evidence, language, history, geography, even their own interpretation of the Quran. They say Baka, that term in the Quran, it refers to Jerusalem, not Mecca. And they point to, specific places, specific events that support their claim.
So it's not just a random idea. They've really thought this through.
Oh, yeah. They're very methodical.
And they talk about the spiritual significance of Jerusalem, how it's connected to all these prophets, Abraham, Moses, Jesus.
Right. For them, Jerusalem is this cosmic axis point where heaven and earth meet, the center of, divine energy and revelation.
It's a pretty powerful vision. And it's not just words. They use visuals too, right? Maps, images.
Exactly. They want us to see it, literally see it, the connections they're making.
Yeah. Like a visual argument. They show us maps of specific places, pictures of ancient ruins, even modern photos.
It's very engaging. It pulls you in.
It does. It does. Okay, so they also talk about the relationship between Jewish and Christian communities, back during the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates. What do they say about that?
Well, they paint a picture of a very diverse and dynamic society where these different groups, they interacted, they collaborated sometimes.
So not always conflict.
No, not always. But they acknowledge there were tensions, political, economic factors. And they talk about alliances that formed, different groups coming together for different reasons.
It reminds us that history is messy. Right. It's not always black and white.
Exactly. There are always, different perspectives, different motivations.
Yeah. And it reminds us that, religious communities, they're not all the same. Right. There are divisions within these groups, disagreements.
Definitely. It's not as simple as we sometimes think.
For example, they argue that the promised land, the one promised to the Israelites, might actually be in modern-day Jordan.
Wait, not Israel-Palestine?
Nope. Jordan, they say.
Wow. Okay.
Okay.
That's a pretty big claim.
Huge. So how do they back that up?
Well, they use a lot of examples from the Bible itself. They point to specific locations like Mount Hor, Petra,
That's right. Yeah.
Wadi Araba, Diban.
All in Jordan?
All in Jordan, exactly. And they argue that these places, they actually fit the biblical descriptions of the Holy Land.
So are they saying that the Israelites, after they left Egypt, they went to Jordan, not Palestine?
That's what they're saying.
That really shake things up.
It does. And they claim that this misinterpretation,
The whole Jordan thing.
yeah, has been going on for centuries.
Wow.
By Jewish, Christian, even Muslim scholars.
So it's not just a small group of people?
No, it's like everyone's got it wrong, according to them.
Okay, so it sounds like the problem isn't necessarily with the locations themselves.
Right.
But with how we understand their significance.
Yeah, like the meaning we've attached to them.
Right. So what else do they say about biblical interpretations?
They go deep into this idea that the Torah, well, it's been mistranslated.
It's translated.
And misinterpreted over time.
Okay.
They claim that the Quran and what they call a corrected Arabic Torah can provide a more accurate understanding.
Interesting. So they're not just questioning the locations, but the whole story, the whole narrative.
Right. They're saying we've been reading it wrong all along.
Fascinating. And what about those specific figures you mentioned earlier, like Jacob and Israel? What do they say about them?
That's where it gets really interesting. They claim that Jacob was never actually called Israel by God.
Never.
In either the Quran or the Second Testament.
But
and then they tie this into their idea of Israel existing before Adam.
Before Adam? Like, how is that even possible?
Right. It's one of their most provocative claims. They even say that this pre-Adamite Israel,
this Israel that existed before Adam.
Yeah, had children named Gog and Magog.
Those names sound familiar.
They're often associated with, like, end times prophecies.
Right, right. So they're proposing this whole hidden history.
Like secret chapter.
With Israel, Gog, and Magog all existing before the Adam we know from the Bible.
Exactly. They even connect it to how the Quran describes creation.
Oh, how's that?
As a gradual process, like humanity developed over millions of years from some primitive form.
So they're trying to bring together science and religion, evolution, and these ancient texts.
Yeah, it's a pretty unique blend of ideas.
It is. But where does Adam fit into all of this? Are they saying he wasn't important?
Not necessarily. They still see him as a pivotal figure, just maybe not the absolute beginning.
Wait, hold on. Are they implying there were multiple lineages, like different branches of humanity developing at the same time?
That's what it sounds like.
But that goes against the whole idea of Adam and Eve being the ancestors of everyone.
It does. And to make things even more complicated, they bring up this concept of humanity originating from a single female mother.
Okay, now my head is spinning.
Mine too. It's like they're weaving together science, history, and religion to create a whole new tapestry.
Wow. So we've got the Promised Land, potentially in the wrong place, a challenge to the Jacob to Israel story, and now this idea of pre-Adamite figures and multiple lineages.
It's a lot to unpack, right?
It is. This is already one of our most challenging deep dives yet. Maybe we should take a closer look at what these sources say about some specific locations.
Good idea.
What about some of those places mentioned in the Quran, like Mount Sinai?
Okay, yeah. The Quran does describe a lot of biblical locations, and these sources offer some, let's say, unique interpretations. For example, they claim that Mount Sinai, where Moses got the 10 Commandments, it's actually not where we think it is.
Really? Where do they say it is?
Not on the Sinai Peninsula, but in the Jordan Valley.
The Jordan Valley. Are you serious? So the whole story of Moses and the Israelites, the whole Exodus.
All in the wrong place, according to them.
Wow, this is huge. But why? What makes them think it's in the Jordan Valley?
Well, they rely heavily on the Quran's descriptions of Mount Sinai and the surrounding area.
Okay.
There are verses that mention a sacred valley called the Wadi of Toa.
Wadi of Toa.
Which they say is in the Jordan Valley, not the Sinai Peninsula.
So they're using the Quran itself to challenge the traditional interpretation of the Bible.
Exactly.
That's pretty clever.
It is.
And this Wadi of Toa, it sounds like a pretty important place to them.
It is. They actually claim that this Wadi of Toa is home to the real Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Wait, the real Al-Aqsa Mosque? Hold on a second. Are they saying it's not in Jerusalem?
That's what they're saying.
But the Dome of the Rock, that's one of the holiest sites in Islam.
I know, it's a bold claim. But they're adamant that the Quran's descriptions, the historical and geographical context, all point to the Wadi of Toa as the true location of Al-Aqsa.
Al-Aqsa, the farthest mosque.
Right.
So what about the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem? What do they say about that?
They tie it to this concept called the night journey, because they say all prophets undertake.
All prophets.
Yeah, it's a spiritual journey where they answer God's call.
Is that like similar to Muhammad's night journey, where he ascends to heaven?
Exactly. And they believe that Muhammad's night journey started at the Dome of the Rock, which makes it a sacred site, even if it's not the actual Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Okay, so they're not totally dismissing the Dome of the Rock, just What, like reinterpreting its role?
Yeah, like it's still important, just not for the reason we traditionally think.
Got it. That's actually pretty nuanced.
It is, and it actually leads to another controversial claim, that the Hajj pilgrimage should be to Jerusalem, not Mecca.
Seriously? The Hajj, that's one of the 5 pillars of Islam.
I know, right? But they're suggesting that Muslims have been going to the wrong place for centuries.
Okay, I need a minute to process all of this.
Me too.
So we've got a potential misinterpretation of where Mount Sinai is, a claim that the real Al-Aqsa Mosque is in Jordan, and now they're saying the Hajj should be to Jerusalem. My head is spinning.
Mine too.
What's the logic behind all of this? Why would they want to change these locations?
They argue that there's been this deliberate misinterpretation and manipulation of religious texts throughout history that's led people away from the true sacred sites.
But why? Who would benefit from that?
They point fingers at, well, various groups, Jewish, Christian, even some Muslim scholars, saying they've deliberately distorted the narrative for their own benefit.
That's a pretty serious accusation.
It is. And it raises questions about power dynamics and how religious beliefs are shaped and practiced.
This is so complex. It feels like so much of what we've been taught about these religions is being challenged.
It's a lot to take in, that's for sure.
It is. This is definitely a deep dive that needs a second part.
I agree.
We need some time to, digest all of this information and really look at the evidence behind these claims.
Definitely.
So, for our listeners, take some time to process what we've discussed.
Yeah, think about what stands out to you, what questions you have.
And stay tuned for part 2 of this deep dive. We'll be back to delve even deeper into these fascinating and controversial claims.
Okay, so picking up where we left off, I think we should revisit the Quran's description of creation.
Oh, you mean how they connected it to that idea of a pre-Adamite Israel?
Exactly. They argued that the Quran supports this idea that creation wasn't instantaneous, that it unfolded gradually over millions of years.
Yeah, they really emphasized that point. Did they give any specific examples from the Quran to back that up?
They did. They pointed to verses that describe the creation of humans from clay and water.
Right.
And suggested this wasn't like, poof, sudden creation, but a process that took time,
Yeah, I see what you mean.
They linked this to the idea of a single female mother as the origin of humanity.
Okay, so it's almost as if they're suggesting parallel lines of descent, with Adam's lineage being one branch and these pre-Adamite figures, like, representing another.
Yeah. It's a radical departure from the traditional understanding of a single human origin with Adam and Eve as the sole ancestors of everyone.
It definitely challenges the conventional narrative.
It does.
Right. What about the Dome of the Rock?
Well, they connect the Dome of the Rock to the concept of the night journey, a spiritual journey undertaken by all prophets.
Oh, right.
Where they answer God's call.
Like Muhammad's ascent to heaven.
Exactly. And they believe that Muhammad's night journey began at the Dome of the Rock, which makes it a sacred site, even if it's not the actual Al-Aqsa Mosque.
So they're not completely dismissing the Dome of the Rock's importance.
No.
They're reinterpreting its function within Islamic tradition.
Instead of being the central mosque, it's the starting point for the night journey.
That's a pretty significant distinction.
It is. And it leads to another controversial claim.
Oh, right. That the Hajj pilgrimage should be to Jerusalem, not Mecca.
Exactly.
That's one of the 5 pillars of Islam. Are they saying that Muslims have been going to the wrong place for centuries?
That's what they're arguing.
Wow. It was like a return to the original.
To the original and proper direction of prayer.
The proper direction of prayer.
Yeah, it's really interesting.
I mean, this just raises so many questions.
It does.
Like, if the true Qibla was meant to be Jerusalem, how and why did that change?
Yeah.
And I mean, what does that mean for Islamic practice today?
Right.
I mean, just so many questions.
Lots of questions.
Really makes you rethink what you thought you knew.
It does.
Okay, now hold on tight because we're going deep into linguistics.
Okay.
Dr. Waleed argues that Arabic, particularly the Arabic of the Quran, is actually closer to the original Canaanite language than Hebrew or Aramaic.
Wow.
Yeah, and he has all these detailed analyses to back it up.
Oh, yeah?
He compares things like phonetic features, grammar, and vocabulary across these different languages to try to show how Arabic has held on to these older linguistic features that Hebrew and Aramaic have lost.
So it's almost like he's piecing together this linguistic puzzle.
It is.
To connect all these languages back to a common ancestor.
Yeah, he's going way back. It really makes you realize those deep connections between these languages and how they might shed light on the origins and transmission of religious texts.
It's a really fascinating perspective.
It is. Okay, hold on to your hats, because this next one is kind of a mind bender.
Okay.
Dr. Waleed connects the Dead Sea, the lowest point on Earth, to the idea of divine revelation.
Okay.
How does he even make that connection?
So he interprets specific Arabic words in the Quran to mean lowest.
Okay.
And he relates that to the place where the angel Gabriel is said to have descended to the Prophet Muhammad.
Okay, I mean, that's an interpretation I've never heard before.
It's different.
And it really highlights how important those specific words and their meanings are when we're interpreting these texts.
Absolutely. And he even brings in the historical context of the Byzantine-Persian War and the influence of Haredi Jews on dress codes.
So it's like this really unexpected blend of historical events and linguistic interpretation.
It's a very interesting mix.
It just goes to show how many layers there are to these texts, and that context is everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, now the last point we're going to cover in this part of our deep dive is Dr. Waleed's distinction between the sacred house, the sacred precinct, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And his take on this is pretty unique.
Yeah, it is.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
So he argues that the Al-Aqsa Mosque isn't actually the mosque that's in Jerusalem today. But refers to a site near the Dead Sea where prophets receive their messages.
Wow. That is a completely different understanding than what most people think of.
It is.
When they hear Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Right. It's a different location altogether.
Yeah, and he connects this to Mount Sinai and the Valley of Tua. Citing specific verses from the Quran to support this view.
He does. He pulls in a lot of different threads.
He really is weaving together this complex web of interpretations.
He is.
Drawing from both the Quran and the Bible to build his case.
He uses both.
It's a lot to take in.
Yeah.
When we've only just scratched the surface, but this is already making me look at these texts in a whole new light.
I think that's the point.
It really is.
To make us question what we think we know. And look at it in a new way.
Absolutely.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
Yeah. I am still trying to process everything from that last part.
I know, it's a lot.
Dr. Waleed really makes you question, like, everything.
He does.
So before we move on, can you just, like, remind us
Sure.
of the distinctions he makes between the sacred house, the sacred precinct, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque?
Yeah, so he believes the sacred house is in Baka, Jerusalem. The sacred precinct is near the Dead Sea. And the Al-Aqsa Mosque is the specific location where Moses crossed the Dead Sea.
Okay, that helps. So where do we go from here?
So he talks about these prophets and how they would journey to this Al-Aqsa Mosque each spring to receive their messages and their orders. So he kind of imagines it as the place where they would receive divine commandments.
So he's really reimagining this whole landscape.
He is.
Where these pivotal religious events took place.
Yeah, and he connects this to Mount Sinai and the Valley of Tua. Drawing on verses from the Quran that mention those locations.
Yeah, I remember him referencing Surah Al-Mu'minun, which talks about that tree on Mount Sinai that produces oil and food. He's connecting that to this idea of this, like, bountiful and sacred space.
Exactly. And it's really interesting how he, like, brings together these geographical references and these scriptural passages to kind of construct his interpretation.
It is.
And he also very clearly pushes back against those traditional Islamic interpretations.
Okay, how so?
So he compares the Al-Aqsa Mosque to Noah's Ark, using the same word to describe them, both Qadis.
Okay, so he's saying the Al-Aqsa Mosque is like this sacred protected space, similar to how the Ark, you know, saved Noah and his followers.
Exactly.
Makes you think about the symbolism of these places.
Right. And remember, he's building this case for Baka, Jerusalem as the true Qibla.
Right.
So he argues it's not simply about facing a specific direction, but it's about aligning yourself with this city that embodies monotheism.
And by doing so, he's directly challenging this whole idea of Mecca as, like, the focal point.
He is.
Right.
He even goes so far as to criticize those who he believes have distorted the true message and have led people away from the sacred house in Baka, Jerusalem.
Does he name names?
He does.
Okay, who does he talk about?
He specifically mentions people like Ka'b al-Ahbar, Abdullah ibn Saba, and Ibn Munba.
And he seemed to associate these individuals with the children of Israel.
Yeah, and he kind of accuses them of spreading falsehoods.
Right, and it's important, you know, for listeners to remember that, you know, this is his perspective.
Of course.
And, you know, these are pretty strong claims, and we're exploring his ideas.
Right.
But it's crucial to maintain that critical lens.
Absolutely.
And remember that these claims are presented within a very specific worldview.
A very specific worldview.
Okay, so now this idea of the mother of villages.
Okay.
I'm intrigued by this. What does he say about that?
So he argues that this actually refers to Petra, not to Mecca.
Yeah.
And he believes that Petra was this stronghold for the children of Israel.
Okay, and how does he connect that to the Quran?
So he connects this to verses in the Quran that talk about a city being destroyed and its people punished.
Okay.
And he draws a parallel to Petra's own history.
Okay, so there's that historical connection.
Right. And he also brings up Surah al-Baqarah, which talks about leaving Arafat and remembering Allah at al-Mashar al-Haram.
Okay.
So he believes that this al-Mashar al-Haram is actually talking about the Holy of Holies in Baka, Jerusalem.
So again, he's kind of like shifting the location
he is.
of where these things are happening.
And he also makes a connection between the mention of Arafat in the Quran and Mount Ararat in the biblical story of Noah's Ark.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, it's like he's finding these hidden connections between these seemingly different religious texts.
It's almost like he's suggesting this shared geographical and symbolic understanding between them.
A great point.
But he also presents this mother of villages, Petra, in kind of a negative light.
Yeah.
Contrasting it with Baka, Jerusalem.
He calls it the Qibla of delusion and a domain of rouge.
And rouge meaning?
Which translates to impurity.
Impurity, okay.
So that language really reflects a negative view of Petra and those who he believes spread falsehoods there.
So it's clear he sees this like stark division.
He does.
Between what he believes is the true faith. Centered in Baka, Jerusalem. And those who he sees as having like strayed from that path.
And he actually calls on people to abandon what he sees as the false Mecca. And to return to Allah by recognizing Baka, Jerusalem as the true Qibla.
Wow.
He even uses verses from the Quran that speak about fleeing to Allah and not associating any other deity with him. To reinforce this call to action.
So he's really urging people to reject what he considers idolatry.
He is.
And to embrace what he sees as the true faith. And he places a lot of the blame for this straying from that path on those individuals that he mentioned earlier.
Yeah, he really does. He claims that they created this like parallel enchanting religion to lead people away from the truth about Baka, Jerusalem.
And he says that they were influenced by the children of Israel. And that they distorted God's words.
Yeah, it's a pretty strong accusation.
It is. It's like he's arguing that this false narrative has been created to obscure the true Qibla. And the importance of Baka, Jerusalem.
Yeah, and he reinforces this by quoting a verse from the Quran that warns against following those who have been given the scripture, but have succumbed to worldly desires and led others astray.
Yeah, that is a pretty serious accusation.
It is.
Now, he also suggests that the true sacred house isn't actually a physical structure at all, but rather a higher spiritual reality. Okay, so explain that.
He uses this analogy of Noah's Ark. Again, saying that the true sacred house is like an ark that saves believers from falsehood.
It's a powerful image.
It is.
So instead of the specific building, he sees the sacred house as like this metaphorical place of refuge and protection from those corrupting influences of the world.
Exactly.
And he links this back to Baka, Jerusalem, suggesting that's where the true sacred house is located, both physically and spiritually.
Yeah, so he's taking verses from the Quran that talk about entering the sacred house and being safe. And he's interpreting them to mean that Baka, Jerusalem itself is the sacred house.
So that's a significant departure.
It is.
From the traditional understanding of the sacred house as the Kaaba in Mecca.
Yeah, he's essentially redefining the concept. Changing its location and expanding its meaning.
He is really turning things upside down.
He really is.
So how does he support this like redefinition?
So he draws parallels between the stories of Abraham and Muhammad. Emphasizing how they both turned away from idolatry. Towards the true Qibla.
Which he believes is
Baka, Jerusalem.
Okay.
So he brings up the verse where Abraham gazes at the stars and says, "Indeed, I am ill." And he compares that to God telling Muhammad, "Indeed, we see your turning of the face toward the heavens, so we will surely turn you to a Qibla with which you will be pleased."
It's really a thought-provoking comparison.
It is.
Right, suggesting that both Abraham and Muhammad were seeking a higher truth and that God guided them to the same Qibla.
Yeah, it really reinforces his argument that Baka Jerusalem has always been the true direction of prayer.
And he pulls from the Bible, too.
He does.
It's just the Quran.
He highlights how God chose Abraham to direct his children to keep the way of the Lord.
Right.
And he even quotes from Galatians in the New Testament, which says, those who have faith are children of Abraham.
It's like he's building a bridge between these different faiths.
He is.
With Abraham as this common ground.
Yeah.
And he uses this bridge to support his claim that Baka Jerusalem is the true Qibla for all believers.
That's a pretty big statement.
It is.
And it challenges those traditional religious boundaries.
It does. But then he returns to this image of prophets making a pilgrimage to the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which he places near the Dead Sea.
He describes them traveling there each spring to receive messages and orders, and he kind of envisions it as the spot where Moses received the 10 Commandments.
Wow.
And where all prophets have gone to commune with God.
So he's painting this picture of this continuous prophetic tradition centered on this specific location.
And he links it back to Noah's Ark again.
Right, using that word Qadis to describe both.
Yeah.
Really emphasizing that idea of the Al-Aqsa Mosque as like a place of refuge and revelation.
A sanctuary for believers to find guidance and protection.
Yeah. And he uses that to support his claim that the true Qibla isn't just a physical direction.
Right.
It's a spiritual orientation towards this sacred space.
Right. Aligning ourselves with the Al-Aqsa Mosque means aligning with divine will and the legacy of the prophets.
So how does he reconcile this idea of the Al-Aqsa Mosque being near the Dead Sea with the mosque that actually exists in Jerusalem today?
So he actually incorporates the Dome of the Rock into his interpretation, suggesting it's part of this larger sacred precinct. And he links this to verses that describe the beauty and grandeur of the sacred house.
So that's a fascinating reinterpretation.
It is.
He's essentially shifting the whole geography of the sacred.
Yeah, he's repositioning the Al-Aqsa Mosque as the central point of reference for believers.
For believers.
And to do this, he's using, scriptural interpretations, historical narratives, linguistic analyses.
Right.
It's a really complex argument.
It is. It makes you realize just how much our understanding of these texts depends on interpretation. It all comes down to how we read it.
Now remember those verses about a valley without crops.
He believes that this valley without crops is talking about the area around the Dead Sea. Suggesting that that's where Abraham's descendants lived and where the sacred house is located.
So it's another example of him reinterpreting the geography of the sacred, right? Moving those key events and figures to support his claim about Baka Jerusalem.
It's all connected.
It is, and it doesn't stop there.
No, it doesn't.
He connects the Al-Aqsa Mosque to the story of Moses crossing the Red Sea.
He does.
Suggesting that it happened at the Dead Sea near where he places the mosque.
So he's essentially saying that the Red Sea crossing that we read about in Exodus actually occurred at the Dead Sea.
That is quite a claim.
It is a big one. He even links it to the verses where Moses receives the divine command at Mount Sinai. Suggesting that Mount Sinai is actually in the Judean mountains near the Dead Sea.
He's moving mountains.
He is completely redrawing the map of these like pivotal events.
Yeah, he's really changing our understanding of where these things happen.
And he's using these reinterpreted locations to reinforce his claim about the Al-Aqsa Mosque being the true place of revelation and the focus of the true Qibla.
It's all coming together.
It's fascinating how he blends those scriptural interpretations with his geographical analysis and those historical narratives to create this like new understanding.
And then he brings us back to the destruction of the mother of villages.
Petra,
which he identifies as Petra, linking it to those Quranic verses that describe punishment for disobedience to God.
And again, he doesn't hold back with his language when describing Petra.
No, he calls it the Qibla of delusion and the domain of ruse.
Impurity.
So this really shows his very negative view of Petra and of those who he believes spread falsehoods there.
It does.
He's drawing a very sharp line between what he considers the true faith in Baka Jerusalem and those beliefs associated with Petra.
And he uses that distinction to reinforce his argument. That Baka Jerusalem is the the true Qibla, the only place for that true connection with God.
And he even quotes those verses about fleeing to Allah and not associating any other deity with him as like a call to action for people to abandon what he calls the false Mecca.
It's a powerful message driven by strong conviction.
It is.
Now, he circles back to this idea that the true sacred house isn't a physical structure, but a spiritual reality represented by the Al-Aqsa Mosque. So it's like he's saying that the true sacred house is a spiritual concept that goes beyond any particular building.
Okay. And he uses that Noah's Ark analogy again, saying that the true sacred house is like an ark that saves believers from falsehood and misguidance.
It's such a powerful image of refuge and protection from those corrupting influences of the world.
And he connects it back to Baka Jerusalem, suggesting that that's where the true sacred house is found both physically and spiritually.
So he's saying Baka Jerusalem itself embodies the sacred house. Which again goes against that traditional understanding of the sacred house as the Kaaba in Mecca.
He's redefining the concept, moving its location and expanding its meaning to include this broader spiritual reality.
And he backs this up by comparing the stories of Abraham and Muhammad again.
He does.
Emphasizing their turning away from idolatry toward the true Qibla.
The true Qibla, which he believes is Baka Jerusalem. He brings up those verses about Abraham looking at the stars and saying, "Indeed, I am ill." And he compares it to God telling Muhammad, "Indeed, we see your turning of the face toward the heavens. So we will surely turn you to a Qibla with which you will be pleased."
It's a clever comparison.
It is.
Suggesting that both Abraham and Muhammad were on this same path of seeking a higher truth and being guided to the same Qibla. He's using these stories to argue that Baka Jerusalem has always been that true direction of prayer. And he brings in the Bible again, to bolster his case.
He talks about God choosing Abraham to teach his children to keep the way of the Lord. And he even quotes from Galatians saying those with faith are the children of Abraham.
So he's drawing a connection between these different faiths.
He is.
Using Abraham as this unifying figure.
And he uses that to argue that Baka Jerusalem is the true Qibla for all believers.
Wow.
Regardless of their specific religion.
That's a bold claim.
It is.
Really challenges those traditional religious boundaries.
And it does.
Okay, so just to clarify, he's essentially arguing that the true sacred house is this spiritual reality embodied by the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which he believes is near the Dead Sea, and that Baka Jerusalem is the true Qibla for all believers.
That's a great summary.
And he believes that both the Quran and the Bible support these ideas.
It does.
That's a fascinating perspective.
It is.
And it really makes you think about the power of interpretation and how different people can read and understand these texts in such different ways.
Absolutely. It highlights the complexity and the nuances.
Okay, so what else does Dr. Waleed discuss?
So he circles back to the concept of Mishur, arguing that it's often misinterpreted as Egypt when it actually refers to Palestine.
He pointed to those verses that describe agricultural practices and crops that he said don't really align with Egypt, but would fit perfectly with Palestine.
And he even brings up those verses about a valley without crops again, connecting them to the Jordan Valley and Wadi Aroba, which aren't typically associated with Egypt.
So he's really advocating for this reinterpretation of the Quran's geography.
Yes.
Suggesting that a lot of events and locations that are traditionally placed in Egypt actually happened in Palestine.
He's really shaking things up.
He is, and he uses this to further support his argument that Baka Jerusalem is the center of the faith. And the true location of the sacred house.
It's all connected.
It's remarkable how he's using this linguistic analysis. And that historical context to challenge those traditional interpretations.
And it really makes you think about the assumptions we bring to these texts. And the different ways that we can read them.
Absolutely. Okay, so now he shifts gears. And he delves into this linguistic argument for the primacy of the Arabic language. Okay, so remind us what he says about that.
So he claims that Arabic, particularly the Arabic of the Quran, is actually closer to the original language of the Canaanites than Hebrew or Aramaic. And he bases this on extensive research and comparisons, claiming to have examined, many languages to reach this conclusion.
Okay, he really goes deep on this.
He does.
So what are some of the details he talks about?
So he breaks down things like consonant and vowel systems.
Okay.
And how sounds evolve over time.
Okay.
And he really highlights how Arabic has retained some of those older linguistic features that Hebrew and Aramaic have lost.
So he even suggests that the Arabic spoken by the prophets was like the original language of humanity.
The original language.
Linking it back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden.
It's a bold claim.
It is.
It reflects his deep reverence for the Arabic language.
Right.
And its role in conveying the divine message.
It's definitely a unique perspective.
It is.
And it ties into his argument that translations can't really capture the true meaning of the Quran.
Right. He believes that those who don't understand Arabic are kind of at a disadvantage because they're more likely to be misled by mistranslations.
So that's a pretty strong statement.
It is.
That raises these questions about the accessibility of the Quran to people who don't speak Arabic.
Right. It also highlights the important role of language and interpretation in understanding religious texts and the challenges that come with translation.
Right. So to recap, he's arguing that the true Qibla is this spiritual orientation towards the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which he believes is here the Dead Sea, and that Baka, Jerusalem, is that true center of the faith.
Exactly.
And he believes that both the Quran and the Bible support these claims.
They do.
It's a lot to process.
It is.
What else does he cover?
So he goes on to discuss the historical presence of Palestinians in the region, arguing that they were there long before the Israelites. He even uses the term Philistines to refer to them.
That's interesting. So he's adding another layer to this historical narrative.
He cites both biblical and historical sources, claiming that they point to the Philistines as a distinct people with their own land and culture.
It's a reminder that the history of this region is incredibly complex.
It is.
And different groups have different claims to the land.
Absolutely.
And then he connects the term Atlantis to Jerusalem.
Yeah.
Okay, how?
So he suggests that it comes from Atlansi. And that it refers to that ancient Palestinian civilization.
Hold on, Atlantis, like the mythical lost city?
Yeah, he believes that Atlantis wasn't a mythical city at all. But that it was actually connected to Jerusalem. And the ancient Palestinians, who he claims were a maritime people.
Wow.
With this significant coastal presence.
That's a pretty wild theory.
It is.
But it shows how he sees this hidden history. Right.
It's been obscured.
It's all very intriguing.
It is.
But, okay, so where do we go from here?
So he circles back to his claim that Baka, Jerusalem is the true Qibla. And the location of the sacred house, arguing that this is supported by both the Quran and the Bible.
He brings up those verses from both texts that he believes point to the importance of Baka, Jerusalem as a sacred space, highlighting those connections and commonalities between the two traditions.
And he even suggests that Jesus recognized the importance of Baka, Jerusalem, pointing to verses in the New Testament that describe Jesus's teachings and actions in Jerusalem.
It's like he's building a case for this shared religious understanding that goes beyond those specific denominations. Suggesting that Baka, Jerusalem holds this universal significance for all believers.
The unifying claim.
It's ambitious.
It is.
Then he turns back to the destruction of Petra. Which he sees as this center of idolatry. Linking it to those verses in the Quran that describe God's punishment.
And he uses really strong language again.
Yeah, calling Petra the Qibla of delusion and a domain of ruse.
Impurity.
It's clear he sees this sharp distinction between what he believes is the true faith, centered in Baka, Jerusalem, and what he views as like the corrupt and misleading beliefs associated with Petra.
He sees them as very different.
And he uses that distinction to support his argument that Baka, Jerusalem is the true Qibla, the only place where believers can truly connect with God.
And he even quotes those verses from the Quran about fleeing to Allah and not associating any other deity with him to reinforce his call to action for people to turn away from what he sees as the false Mecca.
Yeah, it's a powerful message driven by strong conviction. Let's do it.
Man, we have really gone deep, haven't we? Into some really challenging ideas. It's incredible how Dr. Waleed brings together so many different things.
I know, right?
Like geography, history, linguistics, even theology.
Yeah, he really constructs this complex argument.
He does.
That really makes you think about everything you thought you knew.
It does, and it makes you re-examine these assumptions.
Absolutely.
That we often bring to these sacred texts.
Yeah.
You know, I was really struck by how Dr. Waleed doesn't just make these claims. He really dives into the specifics to support his arguments.
You got the receipts.
He does. And like his analysis of the word Atlantis,
right.
I mean, he actually connects that to Jerusalem.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating connection.
It is.
He believes that Atlantis comes from Atland Sea.
Okay.
And he links it back to this ancient Palestinian civilization.
Right. Suggesting that they were a maritime people with a significant presence on the coast.
He even suggests that the children of Israel intentionally hid the truth about Atlantis to keep people from recognizing the real importance of Jerusalem.
Wow.
It's like he's uncovering this hidden history.
Yeah, and it really adds another layer to his argument about the centrality of Jerusalem.
Right. In
both history and in religious understanding.
And then there's his deep dive into the Arabic language.
Yeah.
He really argues that the Arabic of the Quran is the purest form.
Yeah, the purest form.
And that it's closer to that original Canaanite language than Hebrew or Aramaic.
Yeah, he really goes into so much detail with this.
He does.
Comparing phonetic features, grammar, vocabulary across all these languages.
Like he's a linguistic detective.
He is.
Tracing the evolution of language over time.
And, you know, this linguistic analysis ties back into his argument about the importance of understanding Arabic.
Right.
To really grasp the true meaning of the Quran.
He believes the translations inevitably lose some of the nuance, the depth of the original text.
Yeah, so it raises some interesting questions about the accessibility of the Quran to people who don't speak Arabic.
It does. If he's right, does that mean you can't fully understand the Quran unless you know Arabic?
That's a big question.
It's a challenging thought.
Yeah, it is.
You know, it makes you think about the role of translation and interpretation when it comes to these sacred texts.
It's so important.
It is. Okay, so another point that he emphasizes is the historical presence of Palestinians in the region.
Right.
Arguing that they were there long before the arrival of the Israelites.
Yeah, and that they had this deep connection to the land.
He even uses the term Philistines to refer to them, citing biblical and historical sources that describe them as this distinct people with their own land and culture.
And it's a challenge.
It is.
To the historical narrative that so many of us are familiar with.
It adds another dimension.
Okay, so this source ends with a challenge, right? They're like daring scholars to prove them wrong.
Yeah, it's a very bold conclusion, very confident. They say they've found the truth and they want everyone to know it.
It's like they're putting down a gauntlet, saying, come and debate me.
They're not afraid of a challenge. They want to spark a conversation.
They want to shake things up.
Absolutely.
Oh, I think they've definitely achieved that. This deep dive has been, it's been a wild ride.
It has. We've explored some really, really interesting ideas, challenging ideas about, you know, where these important religious sites are, how we interpret history, even what faith means.
It's made me question a lot of things.
Yeah.
Made me want to, like, do more research, learn more.
And that's what a good deep dive should do, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
So this deep dive has been an incredible journey.
It has.
We started by questioning the location of the Promised Land,
right,
and ended up uncovering this vast, interconnected, sacred landscape,
right,
all centered around Baka Jerusalem.
It's really amazing.
We've explored the origins of humanity, the lineage of prophets, the difference between Haram and Moharam,
right,
and the fascinating concept of spatial constancy.
It's really challenged us to rethink our understanding of, you know, sacred geography, religious history, and the very nature of spirituality.
We've been given this this new lens to view the world.
I like that.
One that reveals hidden connections and deeper meanings.
It's really powerful.
But what does it all mean for our listeners?
Right.
What can they take away from this deep dive?
I think the most important takeaway is that the search for the true Qibla is this ongoing journey, both for individuals and for humanity as a whole.
It's about aligning ourselves with those universal principles of truth, justice, and compassion, and striving to embody those principles in our daily lives.
It reminds us that spirituality isn't about, you know, blind faith or rigid dogma. It's about seeking understanding, questioning assumptions, and living in accordance with our highest values.
And as we continue on this journey, we must remember the power of language history and geography in shaping our understanding of the sacred.
By examining the words, the stories, and the places that hold, spiritual meaning, we can uncover, hidden truths and deepen our connection to the divine.
This deep dive has left me with even more questions than answers.
It always does.
But that's the beauty of exploration.
It is, yeah.
You know, it's about embracing the mystery, the unknown, and the constant unfolding of discovery.
Who knows what we might find as we continue to explore. Perhaps this episode has sparked a new curiosity in our listeners, a desire to, delve deeper into these sources, research these locations, or simply contemplate the concepts that we've discussed.
Whatever path they choose, we encourage them to approach it with open minds, compassionate hearts, and a willingness to challenge their own assumptions.
That's what the deep dive is all about.
Exactly. Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep questioning.
Keep questioning.
And keep seeking.
And keep seeking.